All right. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and begin. Um, Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Erica Alfaro. I am the Capacity Building Assistance Advisor for Housing here at APLA Health. With me today, I have Matthew Crean, who is the Life Skills Specialist at APLA Health, and he will be delivering this webinar with me today. So in the housing specialist certification training, we ask everyone towards the end of the training or the third day of the training, what would help you continue to provide quality housing services to clients? And many of you have mentioned that a motivational interviewing workshop would be helpful. So I know that this is not a face-to-face workshop, but I thought that it would be nice to have a webinar for you all because I know that it's easier for all of you to be in the office and not have to step away to go to a training. And so I just wanted to make this webinar available for everyone. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Give me a minute. Oh, there we go. So I want to go over housekeeping before I get into the content, especially for those of you who are new to using Zoom for the first time. So first, I do recommend that all participants minimize their screen. All you should see right now is the presentation slide. If you look at the bottom of the screen, you'll see a few widgets. So you can see the widget for audio. This will give you the call-in information if you haven't called in already. You don't have to use the computer audio and call-in at the same time. You can do either the call-in or computer. You don't have to do both, so just a heads up. Everyone's line is muted, and it will stay muted for the duration of this webinar. As I mentioned in the email I sent out yesterday, unfortunately, closed captioning will not be available in today's webinar. However, closed captioning will be integrated into the video and posted into the Housing Specialist Certification website. And once that's available, I will send it to you all. We do encourage you all to ask questions during the course of the webinar. You can all see the chat widget. Some of you have already accessed it. For those of you who haven't, go ahead and click that widget and you will see the chat box appear on the right-hand side of the screen. When you have any questions, just go ahead and type it in and Matthew or myself will answer those questions during the webinar or at the end of the webinar. I'd like to acknowledge a few agencies for today's webinar, the first being the Los Angeles Housing and Community Investment Department for collaborating with us to deliver the Housing Specialist Certification Training Program, supportive trainings that we've been able to implement, and today's webinar. And of course, Matthew Crean, who's facilitating this webinar with me today. As I mentioned, he's the Life Skills Specialist here at APLA Health and Wellness. And last but not least, APLA Health Shared Action for developing and coordinating the trainings and webinars for all of you. So these are the objectives for today's webinar. By the end of the webinar, participants will be able to define motivational interviewing, recall the 4 principles of MI, describe motivational interviewing skills and strategies, and recognize situations and possible solutions to implement MI in housing services. I'm going to try to make this webinar a little bit more engaging. Due to the amount of people who are logged in, I will not be unmuting people, but instead we'll be using the chat box. So I haven't done this in the past with all of you with other webinars, so we'll see how this goes. I do encourage you all to use the chat box to participate with any questions that Matt and I asked during the webinar. All right, so with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and jump in with motivational interviewing. And I want to briefly describe the history of motivational interviewing, which I'll be referring to MI in the duration of this webinar. The concept of motivational interviewing was born out of experience in the treatment of problem drinkers, and it was first described by William Miller. Later on, another person came in, and they generalized motivational interviewing for different populations. So although motivational interviewing was initially conceived with those who had addiction to alcohol, smokers, or other drugs, it was later generalized to a broad way of behavioral change. So MI can be used for different areas such as dieting, exercising, gambling, and safe sex practices. And the benefits of motivational interviewing have been reported with numerous client groups, including severely substance dependent populations, mentally ill clients, women who are contemplating getting a mammogram, and persons who engage in behaviors that put them or make them more susceptible to transmitting HIV or getting HIV. Evidence also strongly suggests that motivational interviewing can be applied across cultural and socioeconomic differences. So pretty much with that being said, it means that motivational interviewing can be used for any type of behavior change and also for various cultures or populations that you may work with. So, what do you already know about motivational interviewing, or what have you heard about MI? So please feel free to go ahead and add in the chat box what you already know about motivational interviewing. I'll give you all a minute. Open-ended questions. Awesome. Yes, that's part of some skills that we'll be talking about today. Anyone else? Reflecting, yes, Christopher, which we'll be talking about today. Eye contact, it's a counseling method, yes. So all of those things play a part of it. So motivational interviewing is a collaborative, person-centered form of guiding to elicit and strengthen motivation to change. So it's focused to identify, examine, and resolve ambivalence to behavior change. And the key term that I want to point out in the second bullet point is ambivalence. What is ambivalence, or what have you heard of ambivalence in the past? Yes, Ashley, providing information through asking open-ended questions that require a deeper answer. Yes, that's part of motivational interviewing. So the question now is, what is ambivalence? All right. So mixed feelings, yes, mixed feelings, uncertainty, pretty much that is what describes ambivalence. Think of ambivalence as being on a teeter-totter. 1 minute, one argument makes sense, and then the next minute, the opposing argument tips the balance. And I'm sure that all of us have gone through this situation at some point in our lives. We go back and forth on changing our behaviors because there are pros and cons to changing behaviors, but sometimes those pros and cons get in the way. So let's say, for example, we have clients who use substances or who engage in behaviors that can potentially make them susceptible to transmitting HIV or acquiring STIs. And typically they do recognize that there are valid reasons for changing their behavior, but there are also reasons not to change behavior, right? So for some of our clients, we understand that they're surviving whatever circumstance they may be facing. And as housing specialists, part of the responsibility is to assess what barriers that they're facing to achieve housing stability and self-sufficiency, which at the same time, as we talk about in the housing training, leads to improved health outcomes, right? So if someone is housed, more than likely their health will improve, right? So you may have a client who may come in saying that they're ready for housing, but maybe they tell you that they use substances because it keeps them up at night, it helps them stay awake, and it helps them feel safe so that they won't get jumped. Or maybe someone comes in and tries stealing their stuff, right? So they may tell you, hey, you know what, I do want to quit substances, but at the same time, I don't want to because I need to survive the night. And so that's part of where ambivalence may come in, right? It's that dilemma of I want to, but I also don't want to because A, B, and C. In motivational interviewing, this type of dilemma is embraced and it's not challenged. So instead of trying to convince clients about the benefits of a particular course of action, such as maybe practicing safer sex or reducing the number of sex partners, providers using motivational interviewing techniques help them weigh the pluses against the minuses, or the pros and the cons. So here I have two examples of challenges of behavior change, right? So you would think that people would be motivated to take medication on time every day to, one, prevent opportunistic infections, or to reduce the risk of transmitting HIV to others, because we all know that undetectable equals untransmittable. Or we have someone else that, we would think that people would be more motivated to apply for a stable job to prevent losing their housing, but also be more financially stable. As you work with your client to identify their needs and barriers to housing, we do come across these types of situations. And as providers, we think that these reasons should be enough for people to change. But remember, someone who's ambivalent is stuck between the I want to and also the I don't want to. So what ends up happening is, what we often try to do is we give them an opinion, because if we make them see the issue, then they'll change. Or sometimes we want to increase their knowledge, because if they know, then they'll change. Sometimes we try to teach them skills, because if I teach someone how to change, then they'll change. And then finally, some providers may use scare tactics, right? Because if a person feels bad or scared, then they'll change. Now, we want to try to stay away from doing this, right? And I know sometimes we have good intentions and we do these things because we want to help our clients. But why do you think providers should try to avoid doing these things? And you can go ahead and type in your responses in the chat box. Why should providers avoid doing these things? Giving an opinion, increasing knowledge, teaching skills, or scaring clients? It can make someone defensive and close off communication. Yes, Christopher, you bring up a really good point. Anyone else? It will prevent the client to express their actual needs. It's not about us, it's about the client. Christopher and Lanika, you both bring up very important points. I like that these points focus on the client, right? Closing off communication. At that point, a client won't share with you what's going on with them, right? They won't be honest. You won't be able to assess more needs if they're not opening up. And at the same time, we want to respect their autonomy and their choices. And then Ashley, you wrote, won't be able to build a healthy professional relationship, no rapport. Exactly. With motivational interviewing, a huge part of it is building that relationship with your clients, right? And it's the same thing that we talk about in the housing training. One of the steps in the housing services model is building that relationship with them, right? Awesome. So here are some other things that could happen if providers do use the strategies that I just talked about. One, the client may do a small change, but they'll try to do it to satisfy their provider. And what it might end up happening with that is that they won't be able to sustain that new behavior that they're adopting. The client listens politely, but then when they leave, they end up doing what they want, right? Sometimes the client protests, right? They'll let you know, like, hey, I don't want to do that. And then the response of the provider could be, hey, no, but you need to do this, right? The provider wants to push harder. The provider ends up blaming the client and says that they're not motivated. And at the end of the day, no one benefits from it. So it's important to keep those things in mind, especially with MI, because motivational interviewing is a little bit different from case management. And we'll talk a little bit about what the relationship looks like with MI, which would be a little different to what you do when you're doing case management. Now, keeping in mind that you can use motivational interviewing strategies and skills when you are providing housing services to your clients. So what's needed? MI tries to get our clients to work harder, really having them finding solutions rather than telling them what to do. Another way of looking at it is giving them a buffet of choices, and they can decide what works best for them. right? So in the housing specialist training, we talk about problem solving as a way to identify solutions to some challenges that a client may be experiencing. And this promotes self-sufficiency, but it also gives room for clients to feel empowered to meet their goals, right? So I want us to think about an example, and this is something that may have happened to us personally, or we know a friend who may have gone through this, but this is just a general example that I'll provide. So think about dating someone that your friends don't like, right? What ends up happening is they tell us, hey, you should break up with them, like they're not a good person for you. And what we end up doing as individuals is we become resentful, and we don't want to break up with our partner because we want to prove a point. We want to prove that our relationship is amazing and it's awesome, and also because we like to be right. So we'd rather be right than do the right thing according to other people. And I found this quote that I felt really sunk in with that point, right? So people are generally better persuaded by the reasons which they have themselves discovered than by those which have come into the mind of others, right? So people resent ideas that are potentially true when they don't generate them themselves. So keep in mind, this whole aspect here is kind of looking into the autonomy, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes, right? So if people make their own decisions and they're confident about the decisions, they feel very different. When you've succeeded and it's a result of your own choice, you feel a lot more accomplished. With a client who has challenges changing behaviors, this is probably the best thing to do, right? It's having them decide what works best for them. So with that being said, and now that we talked a little bit about MI, we're going to talk about the spirit of MI. And think of the spirit of MI as the foundation of every MI conversation, right? So the conversation that you'll be having with your client utilizing motivational interviewing techniques. So these are the three components. The first one that we see here is collaboration, right? So this is working with your client. Collaboration is a partnership between the client and the provider, and is focused on the client's point of view and the client's experiences, right? So talking to the client about what their concerns are, offering them aid, and also not shaming people for what works best for them. The second component that we see here is evocation. So this means getting information from them, not to them. So asking them, how do you feel? What do you know about this? Or what works for you? Sometimes what ends up happening is that when we give people education, it may be demeaning because they might already know the information. In MI, talk to them about what they know. Give credit to your clients because they're knowledgeable of things, especially if they've been accessing services in the past, right? I know for me as a trainer, I used to do a lot of mock trainings with the old Ziba team, and a lot of the feedback I used to receive during those mock trainings, and even in some of the actual trainings I've done, is gauging people's knowledge rather than simply giving them information that I have to offer, right? So sometimes you'll see in the trainings that I'll ask an open-ended question like, what do you already know about this, right? Because I want to gauge that information from participants. And it's the same thing when you're working with clients. Gauge their knowledge. Ask them what they know about certain things because they may know. And then the last one that we see here is autonomy, right? Clients are the experts in their own lives, and they'll make the choices that works best for them. And remember, when someone achieves something based off their own choice, they'll feel more accomplished. So here's where I'm going to talk a little bit about the provider and client role in motivational interviewing. And this is where you'll see that it's a little bit different from case management. But again, you can utilize the skills and strategies that Matt will be talking about later when you are working with your clients in terms of using MI with them. So with the client and provider role, we want to remember that the client is responsible, right? So as providers, our role is to guide and help facilitate change, not create or force change. And I'm sure that we've all heard about not trying to push our provider agenda towards the client, right? So having clients be solely responsible for their decisions makes us feel uncomfortable, especially when we may not agree with their past decisions. And we may be afraid that, they may not end up doing what we think is the right decision in the future. What ends up happening is that when we have that mindset, it ends up leading us to feel responsible for the client's successes and failures. And so that's why it's important to make it their choice and not put it on the provider. So instead, we're saying that it's important that they make the decisions and that the responsibility of their successes and failures lies in them. We will help guide them and help facilitate those changes by helping them see how the ambivalence or discrepancy between their current actions and future goals are not in line, or how their current behaviors are at odds with their core values. So again, this is really looking at putting it on them, right? And looking back at the housing services goals, part of self-sufficiency is we want our clients to be able to do things on their own, right? That doesn't mean they won't come back and access services in the future, right? Part of being self-sufficient is they know where to go to get those services, right? With motivational interviewing, here we're helping our clients be self-sufficient and making their own decisions. Right, so as housing specialists, you develop a housing plan with the client, and in some cases, some of those plans include addressing barriers that may not necessarily be housing related, right? Because remember, sometimes barriers such as medical care, mental health, access to food and substance use, to name a few, all play a part in being able to obtain and keep housing. And some clients may be ambivalent to change some of those aspects in their lives, and housing specialists can utilize motivational interviewing to address those barriers and develop objectives in the housing plan that may lead to behavior change and positive health outcomes. So now I want to shift gears and talk about the theoretical perspectives of motivational interviewing. So the first one that we see here is starting where the client is at, right? So this recognizes the importance of working at the client stage and pace, and motivational interviewing views this principle as central to its client-centered approach of working with clients. The second aspect we see here is the client's right to self-determination. Disciplines such as social work and clinical psychology believe firmly in the client's right to make their own decisions about the changes that they make in their life. MI is highly compatible with this view and feels than making someone change, a provider using MI is primarily guiding the client through the process of decision making. So again, with MI, the provider is more of guiding that person get to that place and not necessarily holding their hand to do it, right? So whereas many fields of practice have historically focused on the deficits and limitations of clients, MI focuses on the strengths of the clients, right? Identifying and enhancing and using those strengths for them to be able to change their behavior or whatever circumstance they may be facing. And before I hand it over to Matt, I want us to look at the 4 principles of MI. So the first one we see here is empathy. The process of showing empathy relies on the clients experiencing the provider as able to see their world, right? How they see everything. It's kind of like stepping into their shoes. But at the same time, we want to build some boundaries with that, because empathy is different than sympathy. We don't want to burn out, right? So expressing empathy shows the client that they're being heard and that they're being understood, and in turn, the client is more likely to be honest to share and experience their experiences in more depth. The second one we see here is developing discrepancy. So motivation to change occurs when there is a perceived mismatch between where someone is and where they want to be. A provider who practices MI to develop this by helping clients examine the discrepancies between their current circumstance, their values, and their future goals. So when the client recognizes that their current behaviors place them in a position where it conflicts with their values or their future goals, or accomplishing those goals, then they're more likely to experience an increased motivation to make important life changes, right? So a provider can use the client's goals to say, hey, you mentioned that this is important for you. You mentioned that you want to finish school. How can this behavior affect you from achieving that goal, right? That's just an example. The third one we see here is rolling with resistance. So resistance in treatment occurs when the client experiences a conflict between their view of the problem or the solution and that of the provider, or when the client experiences their freedom or autonomy being impinged upon. So these experiences are often based in the client's ambivalence about change. And in MI, providers avoid eliciting resistance by not confronting the client. Instead, when resistance occurs, they work to de-escalate and avoid negative interaction by rolling with it. So in MI, think of it of dancing with the client rather than wrestling with them, right? Because there will be moments where we won't agree with the client, but at the same time, remember with the spirit of MI, we're respecting the client's autonomy. And again, they know their lives better than anyone else, and they will make a choice that works best for them, right? So that's part of rolling with resistance. And then the last one we have here is supporting self-efficacy. So MI is a strengths-based approach that believes that clients have within themselves the capabilities to change successfully. So clients often have previously tried and been unable to achieve or maintain a desired change. And then what ends up happening is that they create self-doubt about their ability to succeed. So in MI, providers support self-efficacy by focusing on previous successes and highlighting skills and strengths that the client already has. So let's say, for example, if the client mentions that, the last time they worked was, 6 years ago, then we can talk about, well, hey, like, what did you like about that job? What skills did you use that you liked, right? Going back and looking at those things where they maybe may feel more motivated to say, hey, if I used to do this in the past and it worked out, then I can do it again. Now, below the arrow, you see phase 1 and phase 2. What this means is that these 4 principles of MI are not used only when the client is developing motivation to change. This is used throughout, once they even enter that commitment to change, right? So it could, think of it like the first time that you work with your client until the rest of the time that you're working with your client. It's not just a one-time thing that you're using these principles. Okay, so now that I've talked a little bit about what motivational interviewing is, we've talked about the spirit of MI, we've looked at the 4 principles of MI. I'm going to hand it over to Matt, who's going to talk about skills and strategies that you can use with motivational interviewing.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us again. So the remainder of this webinar is going to be focused, like Erica just said, on skills and strategies, a lot of which you are probably already using in your roles. You just maybe don't know that there is a name for some of the skills that you're employing. So my hope, or our hope in this, is that as I go over this stuff and explain this stuff, hopefully most of it or some of it will click as things that you have been working on already, and now you just have a name for them. Part of what I liked about MI as well, when I first heard about it, probably about 5 or 6 years ago at this point, was I liked how it was so focused on strengths of the client as opposed to, like Erica mentioned, any kind of deficits or quote-unquote weaknesses of a client. I also liked how it was a non-aggressive approach and very collaborative. It wasn't like a teacher and a student kind of role. It was working together, both provider and client. And something really important as well, I think, is how we talk so much about meeting people where they're at, and it seems like MI is the perfect kind of example or fit for that phrase, because what they hold as very valuable with motivational interviewing is having it be client-driven, client-centered, and client-led. So that to me is pretty much the definition of meeting people where they already are. So if you are looking at your screen, you see the word OARS, O-A-R-S. Erica had mentioned to me too that some of this will be familiar if you had taken the housing specialist certification training. And if you haven't, then this will be brand new. So any idea what this acronym might stand for? I know someone typed something about it earlier, but any guesses as to what OARS might stand for?
So O is for open-ended
Right,
question.
right.
What does the A stand for? Affirmation. Someone mentioned the R earlier too. Reflective listening.
Right.
And then the last one, summarizing. Thank you, Liz. You got them.
That's great. Thank you. So yeah, providers who use motivational interviewing as a preferred style have found that these strategies are particularly useful in especially the early stages of change. They're based on principles that Erica just went over: empathy, discrepancy, rolling with resistance, and supporting self-efficacy. And helping clients to address their natural ambivalence is a great starting point. Um, these are opening strategies that will help develop support or develop client support and help the client explore ambivalence in a safe space in a safe setting. So on the next, this screen here, if you just want to read over, we'll go over them together, but the very first column is the open-ended questions, so O, and some of those examples include: tell me what brought you in today, tell me about a time that, what are some of the things you like about, so tell me, what do you think you want to do about. So an example of, I guess it's opposite, a close-ended question would be anything that would be yes or no. So the goal in asking these open-ended questions is hopefully you get a little bit a more detailed response. Moving on to the A for affirmations. I can imagine how difficult it must have been to decide to come. You've taken a big step. I think it's great that you want to do something about your substance use to be able to obtain housing. The next column, reflective listening and reflections. You mentioned that you are unable to pay rent these last 2 months because you've been in and out of the hospital since May. You're feeling nervous because next week you're having an interview with the landlord for an apartment you've been wanting. And lastly, summarizing. The collective summary, let's go over what we talked about so far. A linking summary. A minute ago you said you wanted to call your therapist, but you're afraid to do so because you missed the last 3 appointments. Maybe now we can talk about how you might go about making that phone call. And lastly, transitional summary. So you mentioned you will be making an appointment today before you leave, and maybe we will see you again soon.
And then I'll chime in a little bit. Again, ORS is discussed in the housing training. So for those of you who have already done it, you're familiar with all of this. Again, like Matthew said, you may already be doing this with your clients. It's just that now you have a name for it. Right? So for those of you who will be participating in the next housing training, you will get a little refresher of ORS. But again, these are just some examples. The purpose of ORS too is to really get that client to tell you their story, to paint you their story, but at the same time, it helps you build that relationship with your client when you're using this strategy.
Okay, the next slide, change talk, darn cat. Motivational interviewing has a lot of acronyms. This is one of them. And just to go through, the D stands for desire. So I want to change, or I would like to change, or I wish I could change. A for ability, I can change, I could change. R, reason, it's important to change. I would probably feel better if I did change. N for need, I should change, I ought to change, I have to change. C is for commitment. So you're making a promise basically that you will make changes or that you're going to make changes. A for activation, I am ready, prepared, and willing to change. And T for taking steps, I am taking specific actions to change. Um, the DARN, the darn and darn cat, is focused on the preparation to change, whereas the CAT is focused on the implementation, taking those specific action steps to change. And the next skill, I'm guessing everyone is probably familiar with the idea of making a list of pros and cons. But this can be a great tool and skill set to use with people who might benefit from having an actual written list out in front of them so they can actually see all the things that you might otherwise just be talking about. So it's going to list both sides of a problem, and it will provide flexibility based on the situation, and hopefully it will help to recognize ambivalence, hesitation, and struggle. And we probably know this both from our professional lives and our personal lives, using the kind of looking at both sides of any kind of situation. Next, we have expanding the conversation. Again, this is probably something that you're already doing when you're just trying to get clarification on something or get a little bit more information and detail. So some examples of that would be saying things like, tell me more about that. What about the last time that that had happened? Can you give me an example? And then asking, what else? And next we have the inquiry extremes. So this is where you are really kind of challenging the stuff that your client is telling you. A lot of it will be all or nothing thinking, black and white thinking, and we're trying to get people to think more of the in-between spaces and those gray areas between black and white. So look for the extremes like never, always, things like that. So just to kind of go over some of the examples from the webinar, so you've never had sex without getting high, you have always drank. What is the worst that can happen if you keep it up? What do you think would have to have happened to you for you to tell yourself, okay, is this enough? So by kind of forcing or generating talk about the worst possible outcome of a situation, it's kind of asking the client to look at a hypothetical situation and see how things could be worse than they are right now, and that they've also probably been in a space where they've been better than they are right now. So again, this is just a way of kind of opening up a lot of that kind of distorted thinking style. Next, we have looking back and looking forward. Much like the query examples, when you use these skills and these skills of looking back and looking forward, it's helping to kind of have the client picture the life before and the life after, if before the problem became a problem and or after the problem is hopefully solved. So using the looking back example, some examples of that would be, when was the last time things were going well and how did you feel? What do you think could have prevented this relapse? Before starting to use, what was your life like? And looking back and thinking about all of this, what do you conclude? Looking back allows the client to see that they have not always been in this particular situation, and it allows them to explore a time when they did not have these challenges. And looking back to a previous time when things are going well, in this situation, more likely than not, drugs and alcohol are probably not as problematic. And so conversely, looking forward kind of achieves a similar goal of looking to maybe when the problem won't be such a quote unquote problem. So using the example here, if you look into the future, where would you like to be in 10 years? How would marijuana use fit into these plans? If I gave you a magic wand, what would your life be like in 5 years? Where do you expect to be next year? So looking forward allows the client to see that things can change and other options are available to them, even if they do not think that they'll be able to achieve that now. And if current behaviors are not in line with what they want, it will likely help them see how they can change their path to make them more congruent with each other. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the stages of change, and it looks like a lot of information, and in a way it is, but it's actually it's pretty simple once we get into it. But just to give you a little background, the change process has been thought about as a sequence of stages through which people typically move as they think about and initiate and kind of theorize and maintain new behaviors. The stages of change can be visualized as a wheel. So if you think of a wheel with 5 parts or 5 sections, there's pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, action, maintenance. So those would be the 5 of the wheel. And then the last one, the 6th one, is relapse. Not part of the stages of change wheel, but it is something to take into consideration because without using the maintenance step fully, relapse becomes even more likely. So in just going through the list here, brief example of pre-contemplation is they're not considering change and do not intend to in the foreseeable future. The next stage is contemplation, where they become more aware that a problem exists and perceive that there may be cause for concern and reasons to change. The next is preparation. They're making choices about whether help is needed and examine one's perceived capabilities or self-efficacy for change. The 4th is the action stage. Individuals in the action stage choose a strategy for change and begin to pursue it. They are also actively modifying their habits and environment. The 5th stage is maintenance. This is where the client makes efforts to sustain the gains achieved through the action stage. A relapse, so that 6th stage here, lapses or relapses that might occur in the action and maintenance stage. The client may lapse and continue change or relapse to old behaviors. So even though that last one is not part of, again, that wheel, it's still a very important piece to have. Oh, and just in something that I saw actually the other day, I was reading a research study, and it said that it's estimated that at any given time when it comes to behavior change or behavior modification, that 40% of people are in pre-contemplation stage, 40% are in a contemplation stage, and the other 20% are either in action or maintenance stage.
And also keep in mind when we are talking about behavior change, this is something that doesn't happen from one day to another. It is a process. And so when we talk about, being where the client is at or meeting where the client is at, it also looks or considers where they are in this stage of change process, right? They may be in pre-contemplation, and as Matt mentioned, a lot of people are in pre-contemplation or contemplation stage. So that's just something to keep in mind, and something not to take personal when you don't see someone achieving change. It's, again, remember the autonomy aspect. The client will be the one making those choices, and we cannot take that in and feel bad because they're not accomplishing it. It's part of the process for them.
Right. And just some of the stuff is just going to take time too. It's estimated that after 2 weeks, that's when behaviors become habits. And so we want to try and get to that maintenance stage within 2 weeks, but it's always possible that a lapse or relapse could happen. So if that were to happen, we want to make sure that when someone does relapse or have a lapse, that they only go back one step rather than all the way back. And for each behavior, you're at one stage at one time, so you can't really be in the preparation and action stage, even though they're right next to each other. it really is looked at like you are in one stage at any one time. So you want to make sure that your client also knows that, and you want to focus on one behavior at a time as well. When clients are told that they can call whenever they need someone, if relapse happens, they'll actually call less and relapse less. They have a sense of a safety net, but if told that they do not relapse, they'll call more. And ambivalence, like Erica mentioned, is normal. And a lot of that is where the rolling with resistance kind of comes into play as well. So we have a client scenario that we're going to go through. Andrew is a 28-year-old client who has been living in his car for 5 months. He tells you that he smokes marijuana to deal with the emptiness he feels inside, and it is the only thing that will make him feel better. He says he only smokes marijuana twice a week or whenever he feels sad. It isn't a problem and it won't get in the way of finding housing. And as housing specialists, you work with clients facing a lot of barriers, but sometimes some clients might not see them as obstacles to getting housing. I'm sure a lot of you have experienced clients coming in and not coming back. It could simply be that they're not ready for change, and that's okay. And it's better for them to come back when they are ready so that they are not only able to get housing, but to keep it as well. There are other clients who do not want to address barriers that would potentially affect them from keeping housing, like Andrew in this scenario.
So now what we're going to do is we're going to look at the stages of change. I want to point out that the stages of change in motivational interviewing are different. A lot of people will combine them, but they're actually two different things. They were kind of, a lot of people combine them because they were both, motivational interviewing and stages of change kind of were both created and developed around the same time. And so that's why people will mistake that they're the same thing, but they're not. We can use the stages of change and the skills that Matthew just talked about to when we are using motivational interviewing. So just keep that in mind when we go over the next slide right now.
And just one other thing to add as well, because motivational interviewing is fundamentally client-driven and client-centered, as providers, we can't tell the client to quit because that wouldn't be respectful of the client or respectful to motivational interviewing. However, you should inform the client about what the Hopper program is, for example, and what the goals of the program are, including housing stability and self-sufficiency. So we know that you're not substance abuse counselors, but it is possible to use MI to help clients begin thinking about change. And we can see how a conversation might look like if using the skills that we've been talking about and the stages of change. So on this slide right here, using the stages of change, we can just go through line by line. So for the stage of change of pre-contemplation, a provider action example could be, what things have you tried in the past to make you feel better when you're sad? A contemplation example, what are the pros and the cons for minimizing your use of marijuana? A preparation example, what kind of support do you feel you need the most and where can you get this support? Action stage example, what might get in the way of staying sober? How can we address these barriers? Maintenance example, you're off to a great start. What can we do to keep the momentum going? And a relapse example, we can't get it right all the time. Let's learn from it and see how best to move forward.
So in these examples, you can see a lot of the strategies that Matt talked about, like looking back, looking forward, the decisional balance. We see definitely a lot of ors here, right? A lot of open questions. There's some affirmations. Of course, we can't see reflective listening or summarizing because we're not seeing the provider's response. But here we can see some of the questions that can be asked that integrate those skills that Matt talked about earlier. Oh, I thought I added an ending slide. So I know that there was a lot of information that was shared in today's webinar, and so I want to ask you all, and I'm going to open it now for questions. What questions do you have about motivational interviewing and the skills and strategies we just shared with you? You can go ahead and add it in the chat box. So far, no questions.
Any comments?
Thank you, Ashley. I know that this was a lot of information that we shared with you. For some of you who participated in the core competencies 2-day workshop, some of these skills that we talked about here or motivational interviewing are covered in core competencies. I will be having a core competencies workshop, and so I just want to throw that out there that will be available, and that is a face-to-face training. Core competencies does integrate some motivational interviewing in it. So based on your manager's response on who will be participating in that workshop, I'm hoping that some of you who didn't do it last year will be able to do it this cycle. But because I don't see any questions, I will go ahead and end I just saw Lanika come in. I think that this is a good idea when you're interviewing to work beside your client, not ahead and behind.
So you mean like in a collaborative way where you're working together? Okay, cool.
Anyone else? Awesome. So I'm not seeing anything else coming in. If you have any questions, you can always reach out to me. You can email me. You can call me. I don't get many calls. It would be nice to have a call. Just kidding. But I will end the webinar here today. Thank you all for joining and being such great at interacting today. I hope that this was fun for all of you. I will be sending out an evaluation. If you can please fill that out because it helps me improve future webinars. So please watch out for that email by next week. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.